My husband demanded a paternity test right after I gave birth. I said yes, then the results said he wasn't the father, but I never cheated. That moment still replays in my head like a slow motion accident. I was cradling our newborn son, thinking we were entering the best chapter of our lives. My body was aching, but my heart was full. David stood beside me, and then he dropped that sentence, sharp and cold. First, I laughed. Of course, I laughed. What else was I supposed to do? But he didn't laugh with me. His face was like stone, suspicion in his eyes, doubt in his voice. I agreed to the test because I had nothing to hide, because I thought truth would fix everything. 3 weeks later, the results came back negative. I was stunned, furious, confused. I hadn't been with anyone else, had barely left the house during my complicated pregnancy. Before I could even speak, David turned away, packed his bag, and walked out. No explanation, no fight, just silence. That night, alone with my newborn, I cried until my body went numb. And then days later, I learned the truth. His mother had rigged the test. David and I met in our second year of med school, both buried under textbooks, exhausted, and half convinced we'd made a mistake choosing this life. We were nothing alike on paper. He was from a well-off Boston family, the only child of two highly accomplished parents. I was the girl from nowhere, scraping by on scholarships, working 3 part-time jobs, and pretending I didn't care when classmates flaunted their comfort. We met during a rotation in trauma. I was flustered and clumsy, and he, confident, calm, and infuriatingly charming, helped me through it, not in a condescending way, but with quiet patience. We clicked, not in an explosive, cinematic way. It was more like gravity, unseen but impossible to ignore. Our friendship turned into late-night study sessions, shared meals made of instant noodles, and whispered jokes across the operating room. The first time he kissed me, it was raining, and we were standing outside the hospital after a brutal shift. I remember thinking, I don't deserve this. But he made me feel like I did. He was the first person to really ask about my past. And when I told him about running away at 16, about couch surfing through community college, about the bruises I tried to forget, he didn't flinch. He didn't try to fix me. He just listened. Then he made me tea, wrapped me in a blanket, and told me no one's ever going to hurt you again. He meant it. We moved in together after graduation. Our apartment was small, the kind of place where you had to choose between using the microwave or the hairdryer because the fuse box was ancient. But it was ours. He left me love notes on sticky pads. I cooked him pancakes every Sunday, even though I hate cooking. We made it work. When he proposed, it was quiet. No grand gestures, just us in our pajamas, sitting on the kitchen floor eating leftover curry. He pulled out a small velvet box and said, "I don't want to do this life without you." I cried so hard I didn't even see the ring. We got married 6 months later. It was a small ceremony in Central Park under the rustling canopy of autumn leaves. His parents came, though it was clear his mother, Victoria, disapproved. She made comments, subtle, sharp. "Interesting dress choice," she said when she saw my simple gown. "You're very non-traditional." David brushed her off, told me not to worry. I tried to believe him. I wanted to be accepted. I wanted a mother-in-law who welcomed me, not one who scrutinized every bite I ate or every pound I gained. But I told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was David, and David loved me. The first year of marriage was magic in motion. We were tired all the time, both working intense shifts, but we still found ways to connect. We danced in the kitchen. We planned trips we couldn't afford. We started talking about kids, casually at first, then seriously. I was terrified. I had no model of what a loving parent looked like. But David said, "We'll figure it out together." When we started trying, every negative test felt like a tiny failure. But we leaned on each other. He'd hug me and say, "It'll happen when it's supposed to." And when it finally did, when that little stick turned pink, he lifted me off the ground and spun me in circles. He made smoothies for my morning sickness. He rubbed my back when I couldn't sleep. He came to every doctor's appointment, even the boring ones. He talked to our baby through my belly and kissed it goodnight every single evening. He told me I was beautiful. Even when I felt like a stretched out version of myself, I felt safe, loved, like I'd built the family I'd always dreamed of. Looking back, I realize now how desperately I wanted it all to be real. Because if I'd let myself see the cracks, the way he always dismissed his mother's cruelty, the times he laughed off my concerns, I might have known, I might have braced myself, but I didn't. I loved him too much to believe he could stop loving me. The night I went into labor, it was storming, one of those early spring tempests that made the whole city flicker. Thunder cracked as I clutched the kitchen counter, a rush of pain rolling through me like a tidal wave. I called David. He was at his parents' place. Again, said he was fixing a leaking pipe for his mom. Of course he was. I told him it was time, and after a long pause, he finally said he'd meet me at the hospital. He arrived an hour later, just as I was being wheeled into delivery. He kissed my forehead, but it was cold, detached. Victoria trailed behind him, purse clutched in one hand, camera already hanging around her neck like she was going on a safari. I didn't want her there. I told David this weeks before, told him I wanted the delivery room to be private, just him and me. He had nodded then, distracted, but now he looked at me and said, "If she doesn't come in, I won't either." The betrayal was swift, sharp. I was already contracting every 3 minutes, drenched in sweat, and now I was being emotionally blackmailed in the middle of childbirth. So I said yes. Victoria stood by my side like she owned the room. She made comments about the nurses, criticized the music playing softly in the background, even told one of the doctors that I looked a bit bloated for only being 9 months along. I screamed through hours of labor while she took photos. And when our son was finally born, wrinkled and red and wailing, when I reached for him with shaking arms and joy pulsing through me like lightning, David didn't smile. He didn't kiss me. He looked down at the baby, then at me, and said flatly, "I want a paternity test." I thought I misheard him. I blinked, my brain slow from exhaustion and morphine. "What?" He repeated it. I laughed, nervously, weakly, but he didn't. "You're not serious," I whispered. "I am," he said. "I need to know he's mine. I don't want to raise another man's kid." Something inside me splintered. In that moment, I realized this wasn't about doubt. It wasn't about logic. It was about the slow erosion of trust, fed by whispers and manipulations, most likely straight from Victoria's poisoned lips. I had never cheated, never even looked at another man. I worked remotely, barely left the apartment, was sick most days and sleeping the rest. There was no opportunity, no motive, no doubt, except the one they created in him. Still, I agreed. What else could I do? 3 weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and aching breasts. My son cried constantly. I barely ate. David stayed at his parents' house. He didn't call, didn't check in, didn't ask about his child. And then the test results came, negative. I stared at the paper for a long time, trying to understand how something so wrong could look so official. My heart raced, my mouth went dry, my baby slept in my arms, warm and real and mine. And now, according to this piece of paper, he wasn't David's. David didn't say much. He came by to pick up some of his clothes, barely looked at me and said, "I guess I was right." Then he left, just like that. No conversation, no confrontation, no willingness to even consider the possibility of error. He was gone. I tried to call, text, I sent photos of the baby, updates, nothing, silence. One night, desperate and broken, I called Victoria. I needed to speak to David, needed him to know this had to be a mistake. She answered, smug. "He's not here," she said. "And even if he was, he wouldn't want to talk to you." I begged, pleaded, told her I didn't know what happened, that I never cheated. He laughed. And then she said it. I switched the samples. The world stopped turning. She said it so casually, like she was discussing a recipe. You don't deserve my son, she continued. I told the lab technician. He's my nephew, by the way, to switch the samples. Easy, painless, clean, just like ripping off a Band-Aid. I couldn't speak. You were never right for him, she went on. Too needy, too plain, too desperate. I told him from the start you were after his money, after his name. He wouldn't listen. So I made him listen. I was shaking, rage and fear and disbelief swirling through me like a storm. But she didn't stop. Now he sees what kind of woman you are. And with Lauren back in the picture, I think things will go much better. I hung up before I screamed. I sat there in silence, clutching my child to my chest. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized it wasn't going to fix itself. No apology was coming, no revelation from David. He had chosen his side. And it wasn't mine. The next day, I booked a second paternity test on my own, a reputable lab in my name. I didn't tell David. I wasn't doing it for him anymore. I was doing it for me, for my son, for the truth. The results would take another 2 weeks, but deep down I already knew. That night, I wrote in a journal I had started during my pregnancy. It was supposed to be letters to my baby, entries about cravings and first kicks and name ideas. Instead, I wrote, "Today your father decided we don't belong to him, but I want you to know we belong to each other. No test can measure the love I have for you. No lie can erase what I know in my bones." I didn't cry that night. I'd run out of tears. What replaced them was something colder, sharper, resolve. Because this wasn't just betrayal, it was war. And I was done surrendering. I thought I knew what heartbreak was. I'd lived through loss, abandonment, the silent weight of growing up in a house where love had conditions and safety had a price. But nothing, not even those memories, prepared me for what it felt like to be left alone with a newborn, holding the aftermath of a man's betrayal in one arm and his child in the other. There were nights when my son cried for hours and I cried with him. Not soft tears, but ragged, shaking sobs that came from a place I didn't know existed inside me. My body was still healing, stitched and sore and leaking in every direction. My mind was fraying from sleep deprivation, and my heart, well, that was already gone. David didn't call, not once. I texted, left voicemails, I even emailed thinking maybe he'd read it at work. I told him I was struggling, that our baby needed formula, that he'd started getting a rash and I wasn't sure what to do, but nothing came back. Some nights I'd lie awake and stare at the ceiling, wondering what I had done to deserve this, wondering if I had pushed too hard, complained too much, been too emotional, too demanding, too something. I questioned everything. Even my worth as a mother. Was I enough? Could I raise a child alone? What if he grew up resenting me the way I resented my own parents? It was during one of those nights, 2 weeks after the call with Victoria, that I hit my lowest point. I hadn't showered in days, dishes were piling up, my son had been crying all afternoon, and nothing I did worked. I rocked him until my arms went numb. I sang until my throat dried out. I paced the apartment like a ghost, and still he screamed. I stood in the middle of the living room, holding him, and whispered, "I don't know if I can do this." I meant it. I was seconds away from breaking down completely when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Claire, a coworker I'd only casually chatted with at work before maternity leave. "Hey, just checking in. I remember you said your due date was this month. How's everything going?" I stared at the screen, tears welling in my eyes. And then I typed back, "Not great. Honestly, I don't think I'm okay." 15 minutes later, Claire was at my doorstep. I opened the door, still in pajamas, hair matted, baby red-faced, and shrieking in my arms. She didn't flinch. She didn't pity me. She walked in, took my son gently, and told me to go take a shower. "I'll hold him," she said. "You go breathe." I cried in the shower, not because I was sad this time, but because someone saw me. Someone cared. That evening, Claire cleaned up the kitchen, made me toast, watched a movie with me while I breastfed. She didn't ask too many questions, just stayed. And that saved me. Over the next week, she came by every few days. She helped me look up pediatricians, sent me articles on baby rashes, even brought me groceries. I didn't have the words to thank her, but I think she understood. Slowly, I started to feel human again. I began writing in my journal more, not letters to David, just to myself. Reminders that I was strong, that I had already survived worse, that my son needed me whole. I revisited the photos I'd taken during pregnancy, the ones I'd hidden away. I looked at my swollen belly, my tired eyes, the smile that still lingered even when things were hard. That woman deserved better. That baby deserved better. So I called a lawyer. I printed every text, every voicemail, the lab confirmation. I forwarded the recording of Victoria's confession. I wanted to be ready, not just emotionally, but legally. I no longer hoped David would return. I no longer fantasized about an apology. What I wanted now was clarity and justice and peace. The second paternity test results were due any day. I didn't know what they would say, but I knew what I would do no matter what. I would fight, not just for custody, but for my dignity and my son's future. Also started reading again, just 10 pages a night. It reminded me of who I was before all of this. Not just a woman betrayed, not just a mother abandoned, but a fighter. And slowly, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in weeks. It was small at first, fragile, like a candle flickering in a storm. But it was mine. The second paternity test came back 2 weeks later. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the envelope with trembling hands, my baby asleep beside me. I already knew what it would say, but still, I had to see it in writing. David was the father. It was printed in black and white, sterile and factual, a confirmation of what I had always known, but more than that, it was validation, proof that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't a liar, that I hadn't imagined the entire nightmare. I cried, not out of sadness, but because for the first time in weeks, I felt powerful. I didn't call David, I didn't text him, I didn't send him a picture of the results. Instead, I called my lawyer. "Let's move forward," I said. "I want full custody." He didn't hesitate. With the evidence I had, Victoria's recorded confession, David's absence, the fake paternity test, it wasn't just a custody case. It was a character case. And David's wasn't looking good. I started organizing my life with a new kind of energy. I opened a new bank account in my name only. I changed the locks. I created a schedule for my son and stuck to it. Waking up every day felt a little less like survival and a little more like purpose. Claire continued to visit. She brought baby books, meal prepped with me on Sundays, and helped me set up a baby monitor that actually worked. She even stayed the night a few times when I needed a full 8 hours of sleep. Her presence became a lifeline. She reminded me that connection could be kind. Not all people who offered help wanted to take something in return. I started therapy. My therapist, Nina, was the first person who asked, "What do you want?" and meant it. At first, I didn't know how to answer. I talked about custody, safety, survival, but over time, Nina helped me see beyond the crisis. What did I want? I wanted peace. I wanted joy. I wanted to build something from the ashes of everything I had lost. So I made small changes. I started wearing real clothes again, even makeup some days. I made time to go for walks, even if it was just around the block with the stroller. I created a little nook in my bedroom with candles and books and a soft blanket where I could sit and journal when the baby napped. And I started saying no, no to guilt, no to shame, no to David's family calling just to talk once the rumors about the test switching started leaking out. I didn't owe anyone access to me anymore. A month after the test, David showed up. He looked thinner, tired, broken in a way I hadn't seen before. He asked if we could talk, and I agreed, but only with my lawyer on the phone. He cried, apologized, told me he'd confronted his mother after hearing from his father that something didn't add up. Apparently, his dad had started asking questions once David moved back in. When David confronted Victoria, she admitted it, but twisted it, said she did it for his own good. He said he'd broken down, left her house, and had been living in a cheap motel ever since. He begged me to forgive him, said he wanted to come home, that he missed me, missed our son. And I told him no, not out of anger, but because I had already built something stronger than what we had. I had built a life rooted in truth, in strength, in community, and there was no room for someone who had once believed the worst of me without even asking for my side. He asked to hold our son. I let him. He cried harder than I'd ever seen him cry. And when he handed the baby back, he whispered, "I understand if you don't want me back, but please don't keep him from me." He nodded. "You'll get your time in court with supervision." He accepted it. As he left, I closed the door gently behind him and turned to my baby. "We're okay," I whispered. "We're going to be more than okay." And for the first time, I believed it. Later that night, after I put my son to sleep, I sat in that little nook by the window. I lit a candle, opened my journal, and wrote something new. Something I hadn't written in months. "I'm proud of you, not for being perfect, but for surviving, for growing, for refusing to be silenced." Because healing wasn't instant, it wasn't clean, but it was mine. Every step forward was one I earned, and I was just getting started. The court date arrived on a Tuesday morning, cool and gray with a hint of spring in the air. I wore a tailored navy dress, simple gold jewelry, and a calm expression I had rehearsed 100 times in the mirror. My lawyer told me to stay composed, to speak clearly, and to let the evidence speak for itself. David showed up looking like a shadow of the man I married. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes were sunken. He looked everywhere but at me. We sat on opposite ends of the courtroom. When the judge asked for opening remarks, my lawyer stood and laid everything out: the fake paternity results, the voice recording, the sudden abandonment, the lack of financial or emotional support, the second verified test confirming David was indeed the father. Every detail was backed by documents, timelines, and cold hard facts. David's lawyer tried to argue emotional distress, said he was misled by his mother, that he had a right to doubt given the initial test, but the judge wasn't impressed. Especially after hearing the recording, Victoria's voice played through the speakers, crisp and clear. "I switched the samples. She doesn't deserve him. I did what needed to be done." The courtroom went silent. David lowered his head. My lawyer asked for full physical custody, primary legal custody, and supervised visitation rights for David. No contact whatsoever with Victoria, a formal protection order to prevent her from coming near me or the baby. The judge didn't take long to agree. Afterward, in the hallway, David approached me. For once, he didn't look entitled or angry, just hollow. "I know I don't deserve it, but thank you for not keeping him from me." I nodded, cool and collected. "This isn't about you anymore, David. It's about protecting my son." He swallowed hard, nodded back, and stepped away. 3 weeks later, I mailed him the finalized parenting plan along with a copy of the court order. I included a note, short, sharp, and final. "We're done. Respect that." The next few months were a blur of rebuilding. I found a new apartment closer to Claire and other support groups I'd joined. It had more natural light, a small balcony, and a nursery I painted myself. Soft yellow walls, a mobile above the crib that played gentle lullabies. I switched pediatricians, started attending a mom and baby yoga class, and slowly reclaimed my space. People noticed. Coworkers reached out, old friends apologized for not checking in sooner. Even David's father sent a handwritten letter apologizing for not stepping in earlier, saying he was divorcing Victoria after decades of turning the other cheek. I didn't reply, but I appreciated the gesture. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. No more rage, no more bitterness, just clarity. I was no longer the girl begging someone to love her. I was a mother, a protector, a woman who had weathered the storm and was. One day, Claire and I were sitting on my balcony, sipping tea while the baby napped inside. She looked at me and said, "You know, I've never seen you look so peaceful." I smiled. "I've never felt this free." That week, I updated my resume, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remind myself of who I was outside of all this. I had plans again, small ones, but they were mine. A writing course, a part-time consultancy gig, a weekend trip with other single moms. I even bought a new dress, red, bold, and absolutely stunning. Not because I needed to show anyone, but because I finally wanted to show up for myself. The Emily who let others write her story was gone. This version? She writes her own ending. A few days later, I receive a message from Victoria. Came through a new number, no name, just a simple text. "I'm sorry." I stared at it for a full minute before deleting it. No reply, no reaction. That was her punishment, my silence, my indifference, the fact that I no longer cared what she had to say. David texted too a few days after that. He said he was in therapy now, that he was working on himself, that he wanted to earn my trust back, if only a little. But trust isn't something you beg for. It's something you protect. And he had dropped it the second someone else questioned me. I let my lawyer handle everything from that point on. David's visits were supervised and structured. He showed up on time, followed the rules, but we didn't speak more than necessary. He looked at our son like he was a stranger he was learning to love. Wasn't my job to help him get there. It was his. Meanwhile, I flourished. My body healed, my confidence returned, I felt beautiful, not because anyone said so, but because I finally believed it. I took control of my life in ways both big and small. I restructured my schedule, cleaned out old clothes, started budgeting with intention, cooked meals I enjoyed eating. I was living, not just surviving. One afternoon, I walked into a baby boutique and picked out a soft onesie with the words, "Raised by a warrior," printed on the front. I laughed out loud when I saw it. I bought two, because why not? At night, I no longer feared the silence. I welcomed it. It meant no chaos, no accusations, no footsteps walking away. It meant peace. It meant freedom. It meant home. It started with whispers. Apparently, Victoria had told too many lies to too many people, and the truth, when it finally surfaced, spread like wildfire. Her nephew, the one who tampered with the lab results, was fired from his position. The lab issued a public statement, and their accreditation came under review. Victoria's pristine social image began to crack. Friends stopped calling, invitations dried up. Her usual brunch circle slowly distanced themselves, no longer eager to be associated with a woman who sabotaged her own grandchild's future out of spite. David's father officially filed for divorce 2 months after the hearing. In his paperwork, he cited irreconcilable betrayal and emotional manipulation, and word got around quickly. He moved into a small townhouse on the other side of the city and sent me a note thanking me for opening his eyes. I never responded. I had nothing more to say to him. David tried for a time to do better. He showed up to his supervised visits, he brought books and toys, tried to connect with our son, but the baby was wary, sensitive to energy in a way only children can be. David would reach out and our son would turn away, curling tighter into my arms. I saw the hurt in his face, the slow realization that love doesn't return just because you ask for it. You don't get to pick up where you left off when you were the one who left in the first place. One afternoon, after a particularly quiet visit, David sat beside me in the supervision room and asked, "Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time I didn't feel angry, I felt nothing. "That's between you and him," I said. "But if you want a chance, you'll need to start by forgiving yourself and doing the work. All of it, not for me, for him." He nodded, said thank you, and left. I don't know if he'll follow through, but it's not my responsibility anymore. Victoria, however, didn't take the silence well. She tried reaching out again, through letters, through mutual friends, even once showing up near my new apartment. I filed a formal restraining order that day. The last I heard, she had been asked to step down from several charity boards. Her name became a cautionary tale in her circle, a woman so obsessed with control that she lost everything: a husband, a son, a grandson. It's strange how quiet revenge can be. It doesn't always come in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it looks like unanswered texts, empty tables at brunch, a blocked number, a child's laughter in a home she'll never be welcome in. It looks like peace. It looks like freedom. It looks like justice without raising your voice. Someone from David's extended family messaged me weeks later, his cousin Sarah. She had always been kind in the few times we met. She wrote, "I just wanted you to know no one's talking to Victoria anymore, not even her sisters. They're horrified." Apparently, Victoria's actions had triggered a cascade of revelations. Old secrets, buried manipulation, stories of how she'd ruined more than one relation within the family through lies and power plays. My case had simply been the last straw. I found myself rereading that message multiple times, not with joy, but with a strange sense of closure. It was over. She wasn't untouchable anymore. And I didn't need to raise my voice or throw accusations. She destroyed herself, one lie at a time. And the irony, all she wanted was control, and now she had none. No son who confided in her, no husband who stood by her, no friends who trusted her, no place at her grandson's table. That, I think, is the worst punishment of all. To be erased by your own choices. A year has passed since the day I sat in that cold courtroom and heard a judge rule in my favor. My son is almost walking now, wobbly steps, arms raised, that determined look on his face, like nothing in this world could stop him. I watch him with awe every day, the way he learns, the way he laughs, the way he reaches for me when he falls. He has no idea how close I came to losing everything, and he never will, because I won't let my past define his story. We live in a different apartment now, smaller, cozier, filled with light. There are drawings taped to the fridge and a little bookshelf where his board books sit in messy stacks. I work from home 3 days a week and spend the other 2 in an office where people greet me with warmth and respect, not pity. Sometimes, when he naps, I write. Just for myself. Memories, lessons, a few pages here and there. Someday I think I'll tell him the story. Not all the details, but the important ones. Like how his mom chose strength over silence. Like how the truth matters even when it hurts. Like how love without respect isn't love at all. People often ask me if I've forgiven David. I'm never sure how to answer. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a single act. It's a series of choices every day to let go of what no longer serves you. And some days I do. Other days, I still remember what it felt like to be alone in that delivery room, begging the man I loved to just see me. But I don't stay there long. Well, because I'm here now, with a son who knows safety in my arms, with a life I built from the rubble, with peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. I've learned that healing isn't about erasing the pain. It's about growing strong enough to carry it without letting it drown you. I've learned that sometimes the people who hurt you the most will never say sorry in the way you need them to, and that's okay. Closure doesn't always come with an apology. Sometimes it's when you realize you don't need one to move on. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe one day I'll fall in love again, maybe not. But either way, I know I'll be okay because I have me, and that's enough. I've also learned to trust myself again. That might sound small, but it's been the biggest victory of all. For so long, I doubted my instincts. I second-guessed every boundary, every need, every plea for kindness. I believed that love meant enduring hurt in silence. Not anymore. Now when I feel discomfort, I speak it. When someone crosses a line, I name it. When I feel joy, I let myself soak in it without guilt. And maybe that's the lesson I hold on to most. We don't need to be anyone else's version of perfect to be worthy of peace. We just have to choose it over and over again. And when my son is older, when he's grown and navigating a world that will try to tell him who he should be, I hope he remembers this version of his mother, the one who walked through fire and came out the other side with her heart intact, the one who never stopped loving him, the one who finally learned to love herself.